Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the eve of this unbelievably exciting, highly anticipated Olympic Games. In your role as Professor of Human and Applied Physiology at Portsmouth University, what's your gut feeling about how much harder it's going to be for athletes who live in a temperate climate in Tokyo, in those scorching temperatures and the very, very high level of humidity as well?
I mean, it's going to be harder. There's no doubt about it. There's no way, even with the best preparation in the world, which I'm pretty sure the GB athletes are going through and preparing for. Are you going to perform better than you can in a cool environment? I mean, the ideal environment, for example, for endurance-based activity is around about an air temperature of about 11 degrees Celsius. So we could be 20 degrees warmer than that. So there's going to be an impact on performance. There are things you can do to minimize that, and there'll be variation between people in terms of that impact. But one certainly would, in a large number of sports, expect a diminished performance.
And would you expect that lower performance to kick in on anything, for instance, that takes the concerned athlete longer than half an hour? Or does the impact become noticeable even after 5 or 10 minutes of vigorous exercise?
Well, again, just want to give a moment's thought to what we mean by performance, because we always immediately, when we talk about performance in the heat, default to people doing endurance type activity, whole body running, things like marathons, triathlons, even tennis and soccer. But also remember that the heat can be quite distracting, even if you're doing something that's relatively sedentary. I mean, the example I often give is somebody who's doing something like pistol shooting, where they're not moving very much, but the margin of error between a gold medal and no medal is incredibly small. And something like feeling uncomfortable, having a hot face, having a bead of sweat running down your brow may well be enough to diminish your performance. So yeah, we're right to concentrate on continuous whole body activity, because that's not just a performance challenge, that's potentially a health challenge. Now, provided the event is reasonably short, and let's say less than 30 minutes, then it's quite hard to get the body temperature above a level where you would be concerned. But if you're going to go on much longer than that, you have to be in a situation where the body is able to lose the heat it's generating. And of course, for something like an international athlete, that could easily be the equivalent to a 1 or 2 bar fire, 1 to 2 kilowatts of heat. So yeah, the general comment is performance is not just endurance performance, it's across the board. It's cognitive performance, it's fine motor skills, and it's endurance performance. And they can all be diminished by the heat.
And what's your view? This is something I'm really interested about. I come from a largely athletics and triathlon background, and I've heard athletes come up with 2 very convincing arguments. There are those who believe an extended period of acclimatization on the ground in the climate that you're going to compete in is brilliant. And there are equally those who give a very compelling argument for coming into that environment as late as possible. Where do you think the true balance should lie?
I think that people should get used to the environment, and I think they should, and I think it's a good idea to do that a long way out. I mean, one of the things I hope that has changed in the preparation for this particularly hot event is that people have run through acclimatization strategies a way out from the event. It always used to be that people would consider a long way out training regimes, nutritional regimes, making sure you're getting your training right, you're feeding right, and then the last bit, at the last minute, oh, what are we going to do about the temperature? And yet the temperature, is, as I say, can not only challenge your performance, it can challenge your health. So what I guess the way I'm going to answer your question is to say, yes, you should prepare for that environment. you should get into that environment as soon as you can, because there's a whole load of not just physiological adjustments, but psychological adjustments that you need to make. But as important is go through an acclimatization regime, maybe a year in advance of the event, so that you know how that impacts on you. You know whether you're a good acclimatizer or a bad acclimatizer. You know, some of these factors should even be scheduled into things like selection.
Well, that's interesting. So an element of how someone is going to adapt is just their inbuilt physiology. You know, their core temperature reactions. You know, I guess it's a bit like every element of life, isn't it? Certain people react differently in certain contexts. So I guess there'll be some athletes who respond really quite well to an extreme environment, and others who, as soon as the temperature goes above a certain Celsius, their aspirations for winning are just about over.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, and we've known this for a long while. I mean, if you go back to some of the original work done on heat exposure and heat acclimatization in gold mines in South Africa, you know, those results threw up the fact that there were, you know, a percentage of people who are naturally heat tolerant and acclimatized well, and there are a percentage of people who were naturally heat intolerant. Now, to some extent, I guess that with the number of elite sporting events that occur in warm and hot environments, there's a bit of selection goes on anyway, in terms of people's ability. But there still will be a variation in people's ability to perform in the heat. And we all know athletes that, you know, don't do so well in the heat. And we all know athletes that don't seem to be impacted by the heat. And so, you know, going forward, it would not be unreasonable for selection, not only of the venue of where a sporting event is going to take place, but also in terms of who's going to be those that can perform in the heat, to be considered, as I say, in the overall selection procedure.
And if you look at the projected forecast temperatures and humidity levels for Tokyo, do you think we will see a disproportionate number of Japanese men and women on the podium? I mean, just to give you one example, when the World Championships in athletics were in Tokyo in '91, I just checked on my research books, 2 Japanese women in the first 4. The athlete who got the silver, that was Japan's first World Championship athletics medal. A Japanese man won the men's marathon, and they had an athlete in 5th as well. So should we expect an upsurge in Japanese success that isn't just down to the support of the crowd?
I think you've answered your own question. I think the answer is yes. And it'll be quite difficult. Well, although depends on the number of, you know, the spectators in some of the venues because of coronavirus, but it might be quite difficult to dissociate those two, you know, effects from the home Olympics versus the home acclimatization and, you know, the people being used to those environments and growing up in those environments. But I would almost certainly predict that would be the case, that you would see people from those kinds of environments, people who over generations have lived in those kind of environments, doing better.
And should we expect more surprising results in general because of the extremities of the weather, regardless of whether the winning vest across the line is Japanese or not? Should we be prepared for the unexpected more than we normally are at this quadrennial festival of sports?
I think so. I mean, I think that because you've essentially got another variable impacting on your performance. So, you know, when these events are held in cool environments, temperature isn't a big player in the outcome. But as soon as you add that as another factor, that's bound to increase. Is another source of variability in outcome, and that outcome may well be it often be diminished performance, whether that's due to physiological factors or cognitive factors. And you know, it's going to demand other things as well. It's simple things like race strategies may need to change. You know, there's all kinds of other aspects which will change in terms of when events are held and where they're held. But you've still got a fundamental issue in that the temperatures in Tokyo and the humidity combinations into what we call the wet bulb globe temperature, which is essentially the thermal stress of environment, are up at a level that is above the sort of cancel event level for something like the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines. So this is going to be a challenge, a challenge for individuals. And as I say, you'll have individual variability in people's ability to meet that challenge, and that'll be reflected in results.
And again, going back to the marathon, which is the obvious example to talk about when we're considering the impact of the heat and the humidity, do you think it'll make much difference that the marathons have been moved up to Sapporo or not?
It depends absolutely on the temperature effect. So yeah, I mean, if it's cooler, then it will be better off. If it's the humidity levels are lower, but that will very much depend on the climate on the day. And the thing to just point out, for people who are not aware, is how important humidity is, because once the environmental temperature gets up to skin temperature and above, so up above, say, 32, 33, 34 degrees Celsius, your only route of heat loss from the body is by the evaporation of sweat. Not the production of sweat, that does nothing for you apart from dehydrate you, but it has to evaporate, and preferably evaporate from the skin. So then, as an example, therefore, there's a lot of thought has to go into and has gone into the design of clothing to maximize the amount of evaporative cooling that can go on. Now, of course, as the water vapor pressure in the air goes up, then the ability to evaporate sweat is diminished. So, if you're actually better off going to a drier environment than you are to a cooler environment, which is why a jungle environment is, in many ways more dangerous than a desert environment. So yes, it should make a difference if you go to a cooler place. It'll definitely make a difference if you go to a place with lower humidity.
The other interesting element about events that are predominantly stamina orientated, we've grown used to expecting incredible performances from a whole host of East African men and women. In athletics terms, of course, I'm talking about the Kenyans and the Ethiopians, and more recently the Ugandans, and there are some excellent other athletes from other African nations. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because some people from outside sport would assume that African elite athletes would be totally in tune with hot, humid conditions. But the reality is that I think for certain African athletes, it will be as tough for them as it will be for Europeans. Because when you spend time in Ethiopia and Kenya, of course, you can get absolutely scorching hot days on which it's very difficult to run, but you would never get the level of humidity that they're going to encounter unless you went down to somewhere like Mombasa on the coast.
Exactly, and you absolutely hit the nail on the head. It's the thermal stress of the environment, which is best described by a combination of dry bulb temperature, which is the temperature that we're used to hearing about, but also globe temperature, which is radiant heat, and also the wet bulb dry bulb difference, which is a measure of water vapor pressure in its simplest form, humidity, when in terms of your ability to evaporate. Now that there's not only a physiological and physical difference between those environments, there's also a perceptual difference. And so anybody who's stepped out of a plane into somewhere which is humid immediately feels the humidity. We don't know how you feel the humidity, but you feel that humidity. And it's something that you, again, have to adapt to and get used to. So in purely physiological terms, your adaptation doesn't matter too much, whether it's hot, dry, or warm, humid. It's determined by the WBGT, but actually your perceptual adaptation, if you're not used to sensing that humidity when you go and exercise, can be fairly significantly detrimental.
And just on a slightly different note, the work that you guys have been doing at the University of Portsmouth is absolutely groundbreaking. Give us an insight into how certain elite athletes have been using your facilities and what you've been able to deduce from watching them in those simulated conditions.
So we've done lots of different aspects of heat related work with my colleagues, most notably Dr. Joe Corbett and the team, looking at things like really interesting aspects like the impact of competition on your performance in the heat. We always talk about heat, and I've already spoken about it in this context, about heat diminishing your performance, but actually adding a competitive element tends to make people maintain their performance and even go beyond it. The danger of that, of course, is all those cues that are telling them to stop for safety reasons get bypassed. And this is one of the reasons why we see athletes running to the point of heat exhaustion and collapse from heat illness.
Like Johnny Brownlee in Cozumel in 2016.
Exactly. And there's another aspect to that which spans the physiological and the psychological. So it's psychophysiology. And again, we've been doing work, my colleague Joe Costello been doing work in this area saying, well, okay, what actually happens? Well, what happens is you get hot, and that actually impacts on your cognitive performance. We talked a bit about it earlier in terms of your ability to do something like shooting and concentrate and not be distracted, but it also impacts your decision making. And so then you make decisions which are not necessarily the right strategic decisions for the situation you're in, which then makes you do something like, I'm going to run off the front of this group, relating it back to Johnny Brownlee. And then, of course, you get hotter still. So there's an interplay between your cognitive physiology, if you like, and your general metabolic physiology. And the two get in this descending spiral where you make worse and worse decisions, get hotter and hotter until you end up collapsing. And I think we'll see some of that. This is why people need to have experience of the heat, have performed in the heat, and have got strategies that they stick to. It's not a great time to be making original decisions when you've got a deep body temperature that's 40 degrees Celsius. And so we've been looking at the other work we've been doing, particularly with the English Institute of Sport, is coming up with standard heat exposures that can be used to evaluate people's level of acclimatization. And this is, I think, is the first time that the GB team has been involved in this, but actually early enough, they've established standardized heat exposures so they can test athletes on that standardized exposure, and they can work out where they are in terms of their heat preparation. And also you identify, as I said earlier, those people that acclimatize easily, those people that perform well in the heat, and those that require a bit more attention, require a longer acclimatization period. And I think that's quite a major step forward and quite an innovation to get thermal considerations that high up the list of priorities for the elite performance preparing for Tokyo. So I really do feel that Tokyo is being taken seriously from a thermal perspective. And I've sometimes not felt that in the past when we've been going to perform in warm environments or hot environments. And then there's other things we do other work on heat acclimatization, whether you can shorten the period necessary for heat acclimatization. The traditional view has been 10 to 14 days, or can you do it in 5 days? What benefits do you get? What benefits don't you get? So, there's at any one time, we've probably got 10 or 15 projects running that are heat related.
Oh, it sounds like you're right at the cutting edge of helping people to get the best out of themselves after years of dedication. And just on a very kind of tangible level for members of the public, how much more liquid would you guys be advising athletes to take on board? I don't necessarily mean in terms of on a competition day, but you absolutely understand how it works at a major games. These men and women could end up, even on a rest day, the ground you have to cover, even walking outdoors, could probably mount up to 3 or 4 kilometers a day just to get to the athletes' dining area and back again, and then to the training facility. How much more water or salts and fluids should they be taking on board on a daily basis?
Well, I mean, you can make some general estimations in terms of fluid loss. I mean, we lose fluid anyway. We're essentially a leaky bag of skin. So we lose fluid through insensible perspiration, through our respiration as well. Half a litre to a litre a day. in any case. But as soon as you start sweating, we know that humans can sweat easily, particularly elite athletes, up to 2 to 3 liters per hour of fluid loss. So now that's not going to happen just walking to the, the newspaper shop and back, but you could easily go up to another half a liter. So, you can see 6 to 12 liters of additional fluid a day being required. But one of the best ways of doing it is to, when you definitely are hydrated, you keep an eye on the color of your urine, you keep an eye on your body mass, and you just make sure that you stay at those kind of levels. So you should always be producing, nearly clear urine, and your body mass shouldn't be wildly changing, because the only reason it can be wildly changing in the short term is because of changes in body water. So it's a matter of just being smart about keeping an eye on the markers of hydration. And often thirst isn't the best one of those. It tends to be, you'll quench your thirst before you're properly rehydrated.
And as you are such an expert in this, when you're watching on TV from your lovely, but what a beautiful part of the world you live in Cornwall, when you're watching on TV, will you be able to sense, for instance, in an endurance event, when an athlete is about to have a wobble that perhaps someone like me as a commentator wouldn't quite yet have spotted? Are you sort of almost instinctively honing in on the warning signs of when someone's overheating?
Yeah, I find it quite difficult to watch all kinds of TV because of my because I can't watch the film Titanic because I think the breath holds are too long. So there's lots of things I can't watch because I'm immediately watching them thinking as a thermal physiologist. One of the real telltale signs for somebody really getting into trouble when exercising in the heat is they blanch white. And if you go back to the incident we talked about with Johnny and Alistair Brownlee in Mexico, and you look at that famous picture of Alistair holding and helping Johnny across the line, just have a look at the colors of the two of them. And what you'll find is that Alistair is pretty red. He's still got a peripheral blood flow. He's still vasodilated. His body is still delivering heat to the skin to have sweat evaporated over it so that it cools. Johnny is very white because what's happening is he's got to the point where he's got so hot that there's a danger that his blood pressure is going to collapse. And so the body at that stage sacrifices temperature regulation to maintain blood pressure, and all the blood vessels in the skin shut down and they go white. So we pretty well know that when you see somebody go from very white to white pasted faced, that they're in a dangerous situation. So that's one of the things. There's lots of other things I see that, I get mildly aggravated by thinking about the amount of money that's spent on, for example, clothing, which we said is really important for trying to make sure that you maintain heat loss and evaporative heat loss. And then a great big number gets stuck over most of the bit that you really want to keep cool, where the air's hitting. You've got a plasticated number stuck over it. So I don't know. Things may have changed, but I just remember over the years getting really aggravated by the fact, thinking of the thousands of pounds that's been spent on clothing development to get the best possible clothing, and then you stick a great big number over a large part of the surface of the clothing.
And in spite of all that, do you think you will manage to enjoy watching the games? It's however many times those of us who work on the games have been there, however many Olympiads people have watched, the potential for inspiration and great stories is vast, isn't it? Will you enjoy it, do you think?
Oh, no, absolutely, no doubt. I mean, there's a few general points that should be made. I mean, if you could bottle the sense of achievement and pride that one gets watching a decent GB performance, you'd be a millionaire. I mean, you remember back to the 2012 Olympics, the morale and the mood of the country was, shifted. I mean, it's very hard to put your finger on what it is. It's not very tangible. And in other areas, you can say, oh, we've saved so many lives, we've done this and done that. But let's not underestimate the value of sport for mood and morale. And my word, we need some of that in amongst this pandemic. So yes, I'll look forward to it in much the same way as I'm enjoying the I'm enjoying the football at the moment and the tennis at the moment, and because it lifts the spirits. But the other thing it's important to remember is we're here talking about heat, and this is a climate change issue. You know, we are going to see going forward more and more very hot days. As I speak to you, you know, Western Canada, Western USA are suffering the hottest temperatures they've had on record, and this is going to be the norm. You know, the once in 100-year flood is now going to be every other year. The once in 100-year a heat wave is now going to be every other year, and it will have an impact on our sport. And on our various sports, and it'll not only have an impact on our sports in terms of the performance, it'll have an impact on where that sport can be conducted, how it can be conducted. We're going to need breaks for water. We're going to need breaks for people to cool down. Spectators are going to be at more risk. Officials are going to be affected by the heat and not make such good decisions. So we need to realize, and you know, those of us that follow sport and are enthused and enjoy sport need to realize that, you know, climate change will diminish that experience, and we need to do all we can to avoid it.
Wow, those are you know, highly articulate, thought-provoking words. I mean, I following on from that angle, I read somewhere quite extraordinary that a disproportionately large number of Winter Olympic hosts beyond another 30 years would be unable to host another Winter Olympiad because they would no longer generate the conditions required with regards to the snow and so on.
No, absolutely right. There's been a couple of reports published by the British Association for Sustainable Sport and the Energy Intelligence Climate Unit. One was Hit for Six, which was about the impact of climate change on cricket, which of course is a sport that's played in hot areas of the world, and you know, is asking people to perform at high levels wearing protective clothing. And the one that's just been published, which is available also online, called Rings of Fire, which looks at a whole range of sports. But absolutely right, in amongst that, there will just be places that historically have been good venues for winter sports that will not be able to be winter sports. And I think, you know, things like the Olympic committees and FIFA and the International Tennis Federation are going to have to think long and hard about where and when they hold their championships, because, as I say, people want to see performers performing at their best, elite performers performing at their best. And anything that diminishes that is going to diminish the overall, you know, spectacle. And there's absolutely no doubt that going forward, temperature will be more and more in the front line of being one of those things that diminishes that that spectacle.
Well, it sounds like it's a good job that the British athletes are able to take advantage of such great knowledge and great facilities as you have at University of Portsmouth. Thank you so much for your time, Mike. Really, really appreciate that. Bring on the games, and I hope we have a whole host of very sensible weather decision-based performances. Bring it on, and thanks ever so much for the insight into your fascinating work.